This is Autumn.
Audible Frontiers presents Dragons of Autumn Twilight, Dragonlance, Chronicles of Blood, written by Margaret Weiss and Tracy Hickman, narrated by Paul Bailey. Canticle of the Dragon. Hear the sage as his song descends like heaven's rain or tears, and washes the years, the dust of the many stories from the high tale of the Dragonlance. For in ages deep, past memory and word, to the first flush of the world, when the three moons rose from the lap of the forest, dragons, terrible and great, made war on this world of creep. Yet out of the darkness of dragons, out of our cries for light, in the blank face of the black moon soaring, a banked light flared in Solana, a knight of truth and of power, who called down the gods themselves and forged the mighty Dragonlance, piercing the soul of dragonkind, driving the shade of their wings from the brightening shores of Kryn. Thus Hume, knight of Solana, Lightbringer, first Lancer, followed his light to the foot of the Calcist mountains, to the stone feet of the gods, to the crouched silence of their temple. He called down the lance makers. He took on their unspeakable power to crush the unspeakable evil, to thrust the coiling darkness back down the tunnel of the dragon's throat. Paladin, the great god of good, shone at the side of Huma, strengthening the lance of his strong right arm, and Huma, ablaze in 1,000 moons, banished the Queen of Darkness, banished the swarm of her shrieking hosts back to the senseless kingdom of death, where their curses swooped upon nothing and nothing, deep below the brightening land. Thus ended, in thunder, the age of dreams, and began the age of might, when Istar, kingdom of light and truth, arose in the east, where minarets of white and gold aspired to the sun and to the sun's glory, announcing the passing of evil, and Istar, who mothered and cradled the long summers of good, shone like a meteor in the white skies of the just. Yet in the fullness of sunlight, the king-priest of Istar saw shadows. At night, he saw the trees as things with daggers, the streets blackened and thickened under the silent moon. He searched books for the paths of human, for scrolls, signs, and spells, so that he too might summon the gods, might find their aid in his holy aims, might purge the world of sin. Then came the time of dark and death, as the gods turned from the world. A mountain of fire crashed like a comet through Istar. The city split like a skull in the flames. Mountains burst from once fertile valleys. Seas poured into the graves of mountains. The deserts sighed on abandoned floors of the seas. The highways of spring erupted and became the paths of the dead. Thus began the age of despair. The roads were tangled. The winds and the sandstorms dwelt in the husks of cities. The plains and mountains became our home. As the old gods lost their power, we called to the blank sky, into the cold, dividing gray, to the ears of new gods. The sky is calm, silent, unmoving. We have yet to hear their answer. The old man. Tico Whalen straightened her back with a sigh, flexing her shoulders to ease her cramped muscles. She tossed the soapy bar rag into the water pail and glanced around the empty room. It was getting harder to keep up the old inn. There was a lot of love rubbed into the warm finish of the wood, but even love and tallow couldn't hide the cracks and splits in the well-used cables or prevent a customer from sitting on an occasional splinter. The inn of the last home was not fancy, not like some she'd heard about and hated. It was comfortable. The living tree in which it was built wrapped its ancient arms around it lovingly, while the walls and fixtures were crafted around the boughs of the tree with such care as to make it impossible to tell where nature's work left off and man's began. The bar seemed to ebb and flow like a polished wave around the living wood that supported it. The stained glass in the window panes cast welcoming flashes of vibrant color across the room. Shadows were dwindling as noon approached. The inn of the last home would soon be open for business. Tika looked around and smiled in satisfaction. The tables were clean and polished. All she had left to do was sweep the floor. She began to shove aside the heavy wood benches as Otik emerged from the kitchen, enveloped in fragrant steam.
Should be another brisk day, for both the weather and business,
he said, squeezing his stout body behind the bar. He began to set out mugs, whistling cheerfully. I'd like the business cooler and the weather warmer, said Tika, tugging at a bench. I walked my feet off yesterday and got little thanks and less tips. Such a gloomy crowd. I was nervous, jumping at every sound. I dropped a mug last night, and I swear, Retard drew his sword. Otik snorted.
Retard's a solace seeker, Galmar. They're always nervous. Would be too if you had to work for Edric.
Fate watching. Tika warned. Otik shrugged.
Unless the high Theocrat could fly now, he won't be listening to us. I'd hear his boots on the stairs before he could hear me.
But Tika noticed he lowered his voice as he continued.
The residents of Solace won't put up with much more, mark my words. People disappearing, being dragged off to who knows where. It's a sad time.
He shook his head. Then he brightened.
But it's good for business.
Until he closes us down, Tika said gloomily. She grabbed the broom and began sweeping briskly.
Even theocrats need to fill their bellies and wash the fire and brimstone from their throats.
Otik chuckled.
It must be thirsty work, haranguing people about the new gods day in and day out. He's in here every night.
Tika stopped her sweeping and leaned against the bar. Otik, she said seriously, her voice subdued. There's other talk, too. Talk of war. Armies massing in the north. And there are these strange, hooded men in town, hanging around with the high theocrat, asking questions. Otik looked at the 19-year-old girl fondly, reached out and patted her cheek. He'd been father to her ever since her own had vanished so mysteriously. He tweaked her red curls.
War.
He sniffed.
There's been talk of war ever since the Cataclysm. It's just talk, girl. Maybe the theocrat makes it up just to keep people in line.
I don't know. Tika frowned.
Hey, John McDonald, how you doing?
Both Tika and
Let's do it, Dad.
started in the loft and turned to the door. They had not heard footsteps on the stairs, and that was uncanny. The inn of the last home was built high in the branches of a mighty Valenwood tree, as was every other building.
How's your evening going, John McDonald?
Of the blacksmith shop. The townspeople had decided to take to the trees during the terror and chaos following the cataclysm, and thus Solace became a tree town, one of the few truly beautiful wonders left on Kryn. Sturdy wooden bridge walks connected the houses and businesses, perched high above the ground where 500 people went about their daily
Nice.
lives.
That's always a good show to
The
watch.
inn of the last home was the largest building in Solace and stood 40 feet off the ground. Stairs ran around the ancient Valenwood's gnarled trunk. As Otis had said, any visitor to the inn would be heard approaching long before he was seen. But neither Tika nor Otik had heard the old man. He stood in the doorway, leaning on a worn oak staff.
Oh shit, all 11 seasons, nice.
The tattered hood of his plain grey robe was drawn over.
That's kind of like how I have Tales from the Crypt. I have all seasons of that one. Well, all seasons of Tales from the Crypt. And all seasons of Tales from the Dark Side.
Hey, the old man blinked. You open?
And they're both on DVD.
Tika hesitated. Certainly, Otik said, smiling broadly. Come in, Greybeard. Tika, find our guest a chair. Must be tired after that long climb. Time? Scratching his head, the old man glanced around the porch, then looked down to the ground below. Oh, yes. Aye. A great many stairs. He hobbled inside, then made a playful swipe.
Just capture your story off.
Get along with your work, girl. I'm capable of finding my own chair. Tika shrugged, reached for a broom, and began sweeping.
Oh shit, hell yeah, I've seen Demon Knight.
He stood in the center of the inn, peering around as though
shitload of times.
Each table and chair.
Oh, he's a little boy.
The common room was large and beam-shaped, wrapping around the trunk of the Baron.
The one he found in the tunnel.
Supported the floor. He was paying particular interest at the fireplace, which stood about 3/4 of the way back.
I let that cool down too much.
It was obviously crafted by dwarven hands to appear to be part of the tree, winding naturally through the branches above. A bin next to the side of the fireplace was stacked high with cord wood and pine logs brought down from the high mountains. No resident of Solace would consider burning.
Oh shit, hell yeah. That's badass, John McDonald.
There was a back room out the kitchen. It was a 40-foot drop, but a few of Otik's customers found this setup very convenient. So did the old man. He muttered satisfied comments to himself as his eyes went from one area to another. Then, to Tika's astonishment, he suddenly dropped his staff, hitched up the sleeves of his robes, and began rearranging the furniture.
I've seen
Tika stopped
all three of the
What are you
Tales from
doing?
the Crypt
That
movies.
table's always been there.
What was it?
A long,
Demon Knight,
narrow table stood in the
Bordella
center
of Blood,
the old man
and
dragged
that
it
one
across the floor
was
and shoved it up
the
against trunk of
Ritual.
huge valance wood, right across from the fire. Then,
But
stepped
I've
back to
always
admire
been a
his
big
work.
horror movie fan.
There, he grunted. Suppose be closer to the fire pit. I'll bring over 2 more chairs. Need 6 around here. He turned to Otis. He seemed about to protest. At that moment, there was a sound from the kitchen, a scream from the cook. He detected that the grease had caught fire again. Otis hurried toward the swinging kitchen door. He's hard. He popped it. Let him do what he wants. Tika sighed and took 2 chairs over to the old man as requested. She set them where he indicated. Now, the old man said, glancing around sharply, bring 2 more chairs. Comfortable one behind you. Over here. Next to the fire pit.
Right, definitely had a lot of that.
It isn't shadowy, Tika protested. It's sitting in full sunlight. It will be shadowy tonight. Won't it? When the fire's lit. I suppose so. Tika faltered. Bring the chairs. That's a good girl. And I want one. Right here. The old man gestured at a spot in front of the fire pit. Or me. Are you giving a party, old one? Tika asked as she carried over the most comfortable, well-worn chair in the inn. A party. It seemed to strike the old man as funny. He chuckled. Yes, girl.
It will be a party such as the world of Flynn has not seen since before the cataclysm. Be ready, Tico Wynn. Be ready. He patted her shoulder, tousled her hair, then turned and lowered himself, bones creaking, into the chair. A mug of ale, he ordered. Tico went to pour the ale.
Yeah,
It
but
wasn't until she had
I wish when I
old man
bought
his drink and gone back to her sweeping that she stopped.
the season box of Tales from the Crypt,
How
I wish it would have came with the 3 movies with it. That would have been cool.
Chapter 1. A rude interruption. Flint Fireforge collapsed on a moss-covered boulder. His old dwarven bones had supported him long enough and were unwilling to continue without complaint. I should never have left. Flint sighed, looking down into the valley below. He spoke aloud, though there was no sign of another living person about. Long years of solitary wandering had forced the dwarf into the habit of talking to himself. He slapped both hands on his knees. I'll be damned if I'm ever leaving again, he announced vehemently. Warmed by the afternoon sun, the boulder felt comfortable to the ancient dwarf, who had been walking all day in the chill autumn air.
What are you smoking on tonight, John McDonald?
Into his bones, the warmth of the sun and the warmth of his thoughts, because he was home. He looked around him, his eyes lingering fondly over the familiar landscape. The mountainside below him formed one side of a high mountain bowl carpeted in autumn splendor. The Valenwood trees in the valley were ablaze in the season's colors, the brilliant reds and golds fading into the purple of the Carolus peaks beyond. The flawless azure sky among the trees was repeated in the waters of Crystal Mere Lake. Thin columns of smoke curled among the treetops, the only sign of the presence of solace. Soft, spreading haze blanketed the vale with the sweet aroma of home fires burning. As Flint sat and rested, he pulled a block of wood and a gleaming dagger from his pack, his hands moving without conscious thought. Since time uncounted, his people had always had the need to shape the shapeless to their liking. He himself had been a metalsmith of some renown before his retirement some years earlier. He put the knife to the wood, then, his attention caught. Flint's hands remained idle as he watched the smoke drift up from the hidden chimneys below. My own home fire's gone out, Flint said softly. He shook himself, angry at feeling sentimental, and began slicing at the wood with a vengeance. He grumbled loudly. My house has been sitting empty. Roof probably leaked. Ruined the furniture. Stupid bastard. Silliest thing I ever did. After 148 years, I ought to have learned. You'll never learn, Dwarf. A distant voice answered him. What if you live to be 248? Dropping the wood, the dwarf's hand moved with calm assurance from the dagger to the handle of his axe as he peered down the path. The voice sounded familiar, the first familiar voice he'd heard in a long time, but he couldn't place it. Flint squinted into the setting sun. He thought he saw the figure of a man striding up the path. Standing, Flint drew back into the shadow of a tall pine to see better. The man's walk was marked by an easy grace, an elvish grace, Flint would have said. Yet the man's body had the thickness and tight muscles of a human, while the facial hair was definitely humankind. All the dwarf could see of the man's face beneath a green hood was tanned skin and a brownish-red beard. A longbow was slung over one shoulder, and a sword hung at his left side,
He was dressed in soft leather, carefully tooled in the intricate designs the elves loved. But no elf in the world of Kryn could grow a beard. No elf but
Tannis,
said Flynn, hesitantly, as the man appeared. The same. The newcomer's bearded face split in a wide grin. He held open his arms, and before the dwarf could stop him, engulfed Flint in a hug that lifted him off the ground. The dwarf clasped his old friend close for a brief instant, then, remembering his dignity, squirmed and freed himself from the half-elf's embrace.
well, you've learned no manners in 5 years,
The dwarf grumbled.
Still no respect for my age or my station, hoisting me around like a sack of potatoes.
Flint peered down the road.
I hope no one who knows us saw us.
I doubt there are many who'd remember us, Tannis said, his eyes studying his stocky friend fondly. Time doesn't pass for you and me, old dwarf, as it does for humans. 5 years is a long time for them, a few moments for us. Then he smiled.
You haven't changed. The same can't be said of others.
Flint sat back down on the stone and began to carve once more. He scowled up at Tannis.
Why the beard? You were ugly enough.
Tannis scratched his chin. I have been in lands that were not friendly to those of elven blood. The beard, a gift from my human father, he said with bitter irony, did much to hide my heritage. Flint grunted. He knew that wasn't the complete truth. Although the half-elf abhorred killing, Tannis would not be one to hide from a fight behind a beard. Wood chips flew.
I've been in lands that were not friendly to anyone of any kind of blood.
Flint turned the wood in his hand, examining it.
But we're home now. All that's behind us.
Not from what I've heard, Tannis said, drawing his hood up over his face again to keep the sun out of his eyes.
The High Seekers in Haven have appointed a man named Hedrick to govern as High Theocrat in Solace.
And he's turned the town into a hotbed of fanaticism with his new religion. Tannis and the dwarf both turned and looked down into the quiet valley. Lights began to wink on, making the homes in the trees visible among the valancourt. The night air was still and calm and sweet, tinged with the smell of wood smoke from the home fires. Now and again they could hear the faint sound of a mother calling her children to dinner.
I've heard of no evil in Solace,
Flint said quietly. Religious persecution. Inquisitions. Tannis's voice sounded ominous coming from the depths of his hood. It was deeper, more somber than Flint remembered. The dwarf frowned. His friend had changed in 5 years, and elves never changed. But then Tannis was only half-elven, a child of violence, his mother having been raped by a human warrior during one of the many wars that had divided the different races of Kryn in the chaotic years following the cataclysm.
Inquisitions. That's only for those who defy the new High Theocrat, according to rumor.
Flint snorted.
I don't believe in the Seeker gods. If it did. But I don't parade my beliefs in the street. Keep quiet, and they'll let you alone. That's my motto. The High Seekers in Haven are still wise and virtuous men. It's just this one rotten apple in Solace that's spoiling the whole barrel. By the way, did you find what you sought?
Some sign of the ancient true gods? Tannis asked. For peace of mind? I went seeking both. Which did you mean?
Well, I assume one would go with the other,
Flint growled. He turned the piece of wood in his hands, still not satisfied with its proportions.
Are we going to stand here all night, smelling the cooking fires? Or are we going to go into town and get some dinner?
Go, Tanis waved. The two started down the path together, Tanis's long strides forcing the dwarf to take 2 steps to his 1. Though it had been many years since they had journeyed together, Tanis unconsciously slowed his pace, while Flint unconsciously quickened his.
So, found nothing?
Flint pursued. Nothing, Tanis replied. As we discovered long ago, the only clerics and priests in this world serve false gods. I heard tales of healing, but it was all trickery and magic. Fortunately, our friend Raceland taught me what to watch.
Raceling,
Flint puffed.
that pasty-faced, skinny magician. He's more than half charlatan himself, always snivelling and whining and poking his nose where it doesn't belong. If it weren't for his twin brother looking after him, someone would have put an end to his magic long ago.
Tanis was glad his fear hid his smile. I think the young man was a better man than I gave him credit for, he said. And you must admit, he worked long and tirelessly to help those who were taken in by the fake clerics. As I did. He sighed.
For which you got little thanks, no doubt.
The dwarf muttered. Very little, Tanis said. People want to believe in something, even if deep inside they know it is false. But what of you? How was your journey to your homelands? Flint stumped along without answering. His face grinned. Finally, he muttered,
I should never have gone.
He glanced up at Tanis, his eyes barely visible through the thick, overhanging white eyebrows, informing the half-elf that this turn of the conversation was not welcome. Tanis saw the look, but asked his questions anyhow. What of the dwarven clerics? The stories we heard?
Not true. The clerics vanished 300 years ago during the cataclysm. So say the elders.
Much like the elves, Tanis mused.
I saw... Psst.
Tanis held out a warning hand. Flint came to a dead stop.
What?
He whispered. Tanis motioned.
Over in that room.
Flint peered toward the trees, at the same time reaching for the battle axe that was strapped behind his back. The red rays of the setting sun glistened briefly on a piece of metal flashing among the trees. Tanis saw it once, lost it, then saw it again. At that moment, though, the sun sank, leaving the sky glowing a rich violet, and causing night's shadows to creep through the forest trees. Flint squinted into the gloom.
I don't see anything.
I did, Tanis said. He kept staring at the place where he'd seen the metal, and gradually his elven sight began to detect the warm red aura cast by all living beings, but visible only to the elves. Who goes there? Tanis called. The only answer for long moments was an eerie sound that made the hair rise on the half-elf's neck. It was a hollow, whirring sound that started out low, then grew higher and higher, and eventually attained a high-pitched screaming whine. Soaring with it came a voice. Elven wanderer, turn from your course and leave the dwarf behind. We are the spirits of those poor souls Flint Fireforge left on the barroom floor. Did we die in combat? The spirit voice soared to new heights, as did the whining, whirring sound accompanying it. No, we died of shame, cursed by a ghost of the great for not being able to outdrink a hill dwarf. Flint's beard was quivering with rage, and Tanis, bursting out laughing, was forced to grab the angry dwarf's shoulder to keep him from charging headlong into the brush. Damn the eyes of the elves! The spectral voice turned merry. And damn the beards of the dwarves!
Wouldn't you know it?
Flint groaned.
Hasselhoff barefoot.
There was a faint rustle in the underbrush. Then a small figure stood on the path. It was a kender, one of a race of people considered by many on Kryn to be as much a nuisance as mosquitoes. Small boned, the kender rarely grew over 4 feet tall. This particular kender was about Flint's height, but his slight build and perpetually childlike face made him seem smaller. He wore bright blue leggings that stood out in sharp contrast to his furred vest and plain, homespun tunic. His brown eyes glinted with mischief and fun. His smile seemed to reach the tips of his pointed ears. He dipped his head in a mock bow, allowing for a long tassel of brown hair, his pride and joy, to flip forward over his nose. Then he straightened up, laughing. The metallic gleam Tanis's quick eyes had spotted came from the buckle on one of the numerous packs strapped around his shoulders and waist. Tas grinned up at them, leaning on his hoopak staff. It was this staff that had created the eerie noise. Tanis should have recognized it at once, having seen the kender scare off many would-be attackers by whirling his staff in the air, producing that screaming whine. A kender invention. The hoopak's bottom end was copper-clad and sharply pointed. The top end was forked and held a leather sling. The staff itself was made out of a single piece of supple willow wood, although scorned by every other race on Kryn. The hoopak was more than a useful tool or weapon to a kender. It was his symbol. "New roads demand a hoopak," was a popular saying among kenderkind. It was always followed immediately by another of their sayings. "No road is ever old." Tasselhoff suddenly ran forward, his arms wide open. "Flint!" The kender threw his arms around the dwarf and hugged him. Flint, embarrassed, returned the embrace reluctantly, then quickly stepped back. Tasselhoff grinned, then looked up at the half-elf. "Who's this?" he gasped. "Tanis! I didn't recognize you with a beard." He held out his short arms. "No thanks," said Tanis, grinning. He waved the kender away. "I want to keep my money pouch." With a sudden look of alarm, Flint felt under his tunic. "You rascal!" he roared and leaped at the kender, who was doubled over, laughing. The two went down in the dust. Tanis, chuckling, started to pull Flint off the kender. Then he stopped and turned in alarm. Too late, he heard the silvery jingle of harness and bridle, and the whinny of a horse. The half-elf put his hand on the hilt of his sword, but he had already lost any advantage he might have gained through alertness. Swearing under his breath, Tanis could do nothing but stand and stare at the figure emerging from the shadows. It was seated on a small, furry-legged pony that walked with its head down, as if it were ashamed of its rider. Gray, mottled skin sagged into folds about the rider's face. 2 pig-pink eyes stared out at them from beneath a military-looking helmet. Its fat, flabby body leaked out between pieces of flashy, pretentious armor. A peculiar odor hit Tanis, and he wrinkled his nose in disgust. "Hobgoblin!" His brain registered. He loosened his sword and kicked at Flint, but at that moment the dwarf gave a tremendous sneeze and sat up on the kender. "Horse!" said Flint, sneezing again. "Behind you!" Tanis replied quietly. Flint, hearing the warning note in his friend's voice, scrambled to his feet. Tasselhoff quickly did the same. The hobgoblin sat astride the pony, watching them with a sneering, supercilious look on his flat face. His pink eyes reflected the last lingering traces of sunlight. "You see, boys," the hobgoblin stated, speaking the common tongue with a thick accent, "what fools we are dealing with here in Solace. There was gritty laughter from the trees behind the hobgoblin. 5 goblin guards, dressed in crude uniforms, came out on foot. They took up positions on either side of their leader's horse. No. The hobgoblin leaned over his saddle. Tanis watched with a kind of horrible fascination as the creature's huge belly completely engulfed the pommel.
I am Viewmaster Turda, leader of the forces that are keeping Solace protected from undesirable elements. You have no right to be walking in the city limits after dark. You are under arrest.
Viewmaster Turda leaned down to speak to a goblin near him.
Bring me the blue crystal staff, if you find it on them,
he said in the croaking goblin tongue. Tanis, Flint, and Tasselhoff all looked at each other, questioning. Each of them could speak some goblin, Tas better than the others. Had they heard right? A blue crystal staff.
If they resist,
added Viewmaster Turda, switching back to common for grand effect,
kill them.
With that, he yanked on the reins, flicked his mount with a riding crop, and galloped off down the path toward town.
Goblins in Solace. This new theocrat has much to answer for.
Flint spat. Reaching up, he swung his battle axe from its holder on his back and planted his feet firmly on the path, rocking back and forth until he felt himself balanced.
Very well,
he announced.
Come on.
I advise you to retreat, Tanis said, throwing his cloak over one shoulder and drawing his sword. We have had a long journey, and we are hungry and tired and late for a meeting with friends we have not seen in a long time. We have no intention of being arrested.
Or of being killed,
added Tasselhoff. He had drawn no weapon, but stood staring at the goblins with interest. A bit taken aback, the goblins glanced at each other nervously. One cast a baleful look down the road where his leader had vanished. The goblins were accustomed to bullying peddlers and farmers traveling to the small town, not to challenging armed and obviously skilled fighters. But their hatred of the other races of Kryn was long-standing. They drew their long, curved blades. Flint strode forward, his hands getting a firm grip on the axe handle.
There's only one creature I hate worse than a gully dwarf, he muttered, and that's a goblin.
The goblin dove at Flint, hoping to knock him down. Flint swung his axe with deadly accuracy and timing. A goblin head rolled into the dust, the body crashing to the ground. "What are you swine doing in Solace?" Tanis asked, meeting the clumsy stab of another goblin skillfully. Their swords crossed and held for a moment. Then Tanis shoved the goblin backward. "Do you work for the High Theocrat?"
Theocrat?
The goblin gurgled with laughter. Swinging its weapon wildly, it ran at Tanis.
That fool! Our Viewmaster works for the...
The creature impaled itself on Tanis's sword. It groaned, then slid off onto the ground. Damn! Tanis swore and stared at the dead goblin in frustration. The clumsy idiot! I didn't want to kill it. Just find out who hired it.
You'll find out who hired us sooner than you'd like,
snarled another goblin, rushing at the distracted half-elf. Tanis turned quickly and disarmed the creature. He kicked it in its stomach, and the goblin crumpled over. Another goblin sprang at Flint before the dwarf had time to recover from his lethal swing. He staggered backward, trying to regain his balance. Then Tasselhoff's shrill voice rang out. "These scum will fight for anyone, Tanis. Throw them some dog meat once in a while, and they're yours forever."
Dog meat?
The goblin croaked, and turned from Flint in a rage.
How about kinder meat, you little squeaker?
The goblin flapped toward the apparently unarmed Kender, its purplish red hands grasping for his neck. Tas without ever losing the innocent, childlike expression on his face, reached into his fleecy vest, whipped out a dagger, and threw it, all in one motion. The goblin clutched his chest and fell with a groan. There was a sound of flapping feet as the remaining goblin fled. The battle was over. Tanis sheathed his sword, grimacing in disgust at the stinking bodies. The smell reminded him of rotting fish. Flint wiped black goblin blood from his axe blade. Tas stared mournfully at the body of the goblin he killed. It had fallen face down, his dagger buried underneath. "I'll get it for you," Tanis offered, preparing to roll the body over. "No," Tas made a face. "I don't want it back. You can never get rid of the smell, you know." Tanis nodded. Flint fastened his axe in its carrier again, and the three continued on down the path. The lights of Solace grew brighter as darkness deepened. The smell of the wood smoke on the chill night air brought thoughts of food and warmth and safety. The companions hurried their steps. They did not speak for a long time, each hearing Flint's words echo in his mind. Goblins. In Solace. Finally, however, the irrepressible Kender giggled. "Besides," he said, "that dagger was Flint's." Chapter 2. Return to the inn. A shock. The oath is broken. Nearly everyone in Solace managed to drop into the inn of the last home, sometime during the evening hours these days. People felt safer in crowds. Solace had long been a crossroads for travelers. They came northeast from Haven, the Seeker capital. They came from the elven kingdom of Qualinesti to the south. Sometimes they came from the east, across the barren plains of Abyssinia. Throughout the civilized world, the Inn of the Last Home was known as a traveler's refuge and center for news. It was to the inn that the three friends turned their steps. The huge, convoluted trunk rose through the surrounding trees. Against the shadow of the Valenwood, the colored panes of the inn's stained glass windows glittered brightly, and sounds of life drifted down from the windows. Lanterns, hanging from the tree limbs, lit the winding stairway. Though the autumn night was settling chill amid the Valenwoods of Solace, the travelers felt the companionship and memories warm the soul and wash away the aches and sorrows of the road. The inn was so crowded on this night that the three were continually forced to stand aside on the stairs to let men, women, and children pass them. Tanis noticed that people glanced at him and his companions with suspicion, not with the welcoming looks they would have given 5 years ago. Tanis's face grew grim. This was not the homecoming he had dreamed about. Never in the 50 years he had lived in Solace had he felt such tension.
Right back.
The rumors he had heard about the malignant corruption of the Seekers must be true. 5 years ago, the men calling themselves Seekers, we seek the new gods, had been a loose-knit organization of clerics practicing their new religion in the towns of Haven, Solace, and Gateway. These clerics had been misguided, Tanis believed, but at least they had been honest and sincere. In the intervening years, however, the clerics had gained more and more status as their religion flourished. Soon they became concerned not so much with glory in the afterlife as with power on Kryn. They took over the governing of the towns with the people's blessing. A touch on Tanis's arm interrupted his thoughts. He turned and saw Flint silently pointing below. Looking down, Tanis saw guards marching past, walking in parties of 4, Armed to the teeth, they strutted with an air of self-importance.
At least they're human, not goblin,
Tass said. That goblin sneered when I mentioned the high theocrat. Tanis mused, as if they were working for someone else. I wonder
Hey,
what's going
Troy,
on.
how you doing?
maybe our friends will know.
Let's do a dab.
Flint said.
If they're here,
Tasselhoff added. A
Excuse
lot
me.
could have happened in 5 years.
They'll be here, if they're alive.
Flint added in an undertone.
It was a sacred oath we took, to meet again after 5 years had passed and report what we had found out about the evil spreading in the world. To think we should come home and find evil on our very doorsteps. Hush, shh.
Several passers-by looked so alarmed at the dwarf's words that Tanis shook his head. I do not talk about it here, the half-elf advised. Reaching the top of the stairs, Tass flung the door open wide. A wave of light, noise, heat, and the familiar smell of Otik's spicy potatoes hit them full in the face. It engulfed them and washed over them soothing. Otik, standing behind the bar as they always remembered him, hadn't changed, except maybe to grow stout. The inn didn't appear to have changed either, except to grow more comfortable. Tasselhoff, his quick, tender eyes sweeping the crowd, gave a yell and pointed across the room. Something else hadn't changed either. The firelight gleaming on a brightly polished, winged dragon tail.
Who is it?
Asked Flynn, straining to see. Caraman, Tanis replied.
Then Raceland will be here too.
Flynn said, without a great deal of warmth in his voice. Tasselhoff was already sliding through the muttering knots of people, his small, lithe body barely noticed by those he passed. Tanis hoped first that there wasn't a fire, any objects from the inside. Not that he stole things. Tasselhoff would have been deeply hurt if anyone had accused him of theft. But the Kender had an insatiable curiosity, and various interesting items belonging to other people falling into Tasselhoff's possession. The last thing Tanis wanted tonight was trouble. He made a mental note to have a private word with the Kender. The half-elf and the dwarf made their way through the crowd with less ease than their little friend.
How you
Nearly
doing,
every
Troy?
chair was taken, every table filled. Those who could not find room to sit down were standing, talking in low voices. People looked at Tanis and Flint darkly, suspiciously, or curiously. No one greeted Flint, although there were several who had been long-standing customers of the dwarven metalsmith. The people of Solace had their own problems, and it was apparent that Tanis and Flint were now considered outsiders. A roar sounded from across the room, from the table where the dragon helm lay reflecting light from the fire. Tanis's grim face relaxed into a smile as he saw the giant Caraman lift little Tass off the floor in a bear hug. Flint, wading through a sea of belt buckles, could only imagine the sight as he listened to Caraman's booming voice answering Tasselhoff's piping greeting.
Caraman better look to his purse,
Flint grumbled,
or count his teeth.
The dwarf and the half-elf finally broke through the press of people in front of the long bar. The table where Caraman sat was shoved back against the tree trunk. In fact, it was sitting in an odd position. Tanis wondered why Otik had moved it, when everything else remained exactly the same. But the thought was crushed out of him, for it was his turn to receive the big warrior's affectionate greeting. Tanis hastily removed the longbow and quiver of arrows from his back before Caraman hugged them into kindling.
My friend.
Caraman's eyes were wet. He seemed about to say more, but was overcome by emotion. Tanis was also momentarily unable to talk. This was because he'd had his breath squeezed out of him by Caraman's muscular arms. "Where's Race?" he asked when he could talk. The twins were never far apart. "There." Caraman nodded toward the end of the table. Then he frowned. "He's changed." The warrior warned Tannis. The half-elf looked into a corner formed by an irregularity of the valenwood tree. The corner was shrouded in shadow, and for a moment he couldn't see anything after the glare of the fire. Then he saw a slight figure sitting, huddled in red robes, even in the heat of the nearby fire. The figure had a hood cast over its face. Tannis felt a sudden reluctance to speak to the young mage alone. But Tasselhoff had flitted away to find the barmaid, and Flint was being lifted off his feet by Caraman. Tannis moved to the end of the table. "Raceland," he said, feeling a strange sense of foreboding. The robed figure looked up. "Tannis," the man whispered as he slowly pulled his hood off his head. The half-elf sucked in his breath and fell back a piece. He stared in horror. The face that turned toward him from the shadows was a face out of a nightmare. "Changed," Caraman had said. Tannis shuddered. Changed wasn't the word. The mage's white skin had turned a golden color. It glistened in the firelight with a faintly metallic quality, looking like a gruesome mask. The flesh had melted from the face, leaving the cheekbones outlined in dreadful shadows. The lips were pulled tight in a dark, straight line. But it was the man's eyes that arrested Tannis and held him pinned in their terrible gaze, for the eyes were no longer the eyes of any living human Tannis had ever seen. The black pupils were now the shape of hourglasses. The pale blue irises Tannis remembered now glittered gold. "I see my appearance startles you," Raceland whispered. There was a faint suggestion of a smile on his thin lips. Sitting down across from the young man, Tannis swallowed. "In the name of the true gods, Raceland." Flint plopped into a seat next to Tannis. "I've been hoisted into the air more times today than reorcs." Flint's eyes widened. "What evil's at work here? Are you cursed?" The dwarf gasped, staring at Raceland. Caraman took a seat next to his brother. He picked up his mug of ale and glanced at Raceland. "Will you tell them, Race?" he said in a low voice. "Yes," Raceland said, drawing the word out into a hiss that made Tannis shiver. The young man spoke in a soft, wheezing voice, barely above a whisper, as if it were all he could do to force the words out of his body. His long, nervous hands, which were the same golden color as his face, toyed absently with uneaten food on a plate before him. "Do you remember when we parted 5 years ago?" Raceland began. "My brother and I planned a journey so secret, I could not even tell you, my dear friend, where we were going." There was a faint note of sarcasm in the gentle voice. Tannis bit his lip. Raceland had never in his entire life had any dear friend. "I had been selected by our Saint, the head of my order, to take the test," Raceland continued. "The test?" Tannis repeated, stunned. "But you were too young. What, 20? The test is given only to mages who have studied years and years." "You can't imagine my pride," Raceland said coldly, irritated at the interruption. "My brother and I traveled to the secret place, the fabled towers of High Sorcery, and there I passed the test." The mage's voice sank.
And there I nearly died.
Karaman choked, obviously in the grip of some strong emotion. It was awful. The big man began, his voice shaking. I found him in that horrible place, blood flowing from his mouth, dying. I picked him up and...
Enough, brother.
Raceland's soft voice flicked like a whip. Karaman flinched. Tanis saw the young mage's golden eyes narrow, the thin hands clenched. Karaman fell silent and gulped down his ale, glancing nervously at his brother. There was clearly a new strain, a tension between the twins. Raceland drew a deep breath and continued.
When I awoke,
The mage said,
my skin had turned this color, the mark of my suffering. My body and my health are irretrievably shattered. And my eyes, I see through hourglass pupils, and therefore I see time as it affects all things. Even as I look at you now, Tanis,
the mage whispered,
I see you dying, slowly, by inches. And so I see every living thing.
Raceland's thin, claw-like hand gripped Tanis's arm. The half-elf shivered at the cold touch and started to pull away, but the golden eyes and the cold hand held him fast. The mage leaned forward, his eyes glowing feverishly.
But I have power now, he whispered. Parsalian told me the day would come when my strength would shape the world. I have power, and
He gestured.
the staff of Magius.
Tanis looked to see a staff leaning against the Valenwood trunk, within easy reach of Raceland's hand. It was a plain wooden staff, a ball of bright crystal clutched in a disembodied golden claw, carved to resemble the talon of a dragon, gleamed at the top. Was it worth it? Tanis asked quietly. Raceland stared at him. Then his lips parted in a caricature of a grin. He withdrew his hand from Tanis's arm and folded his arms in the sleeves of his robe.
Of course,
The mage hissed.
power is what I have long sought, and still seek.
He leaned back, and his thin figure melted into the dark shadow, until all Tanis could see were the golden eyes glittering in the firelight.
Hail,
Said Flint, clearing his throat and licking his lips as if he would wash a bad taste out of his mouth.
where is that kidder? I suppose he stole the barmaid.
Here we are, cried Tass's cheerful voice. A tall, young, red-haired girl loomed behind him, carrying a tray of mugs. Karaman grinned.
Now, Tanis,
He boomed.
guess who that is?
You too, Flint. If you win, I'll buy this round. Glad to take his mind off Raceland's dark table, Tanis stared at the laughing girl. Red hair curled around her face. Her green eyes danced with fun. Freckles were lightly smattered across her nose and cheeks. Tanis seemed to remember the eyes, but beyond that, he was blank. I give up, he said. But then to elves, humans seem to change so rapidly that we lose track. I am 102, yet seem no more than 30 to you, and to me those 100 years seem as 30. This young woman must have been a child when we left. I was 14. The girl laughed and set the tray down on the table. And Karen used to say I was so ugly my father would have to pay someone to marry me.
Chica!
Flint slammed his fist on the table.
You're buying, you great oaf.
He pointed at Karen.
No fair.
The giant laughed.
She gave you a clue.
Well, the years have proved him wrong, Tanis said, smiling. I've traveled many roads, and you're one of the prettiest girls I've seen on Crete. Tika blushed with pleasure. Then her face darkened. By the way, Tanis, she reached in her pocket and drew forth a cylindrical object. This arrived for you today, under strange circumstances. Tanis frowned and reached for the object. It was a small scroll case made of black, highly polished wood. He slowly removed a thin piece of parchment and unrolled it. His heart thudded painfully at the sight of the bold, black handwriting. It's from Kitiara, he said finally, knowing his voice sounded strained and unnatural. She's not coming. There was a moment's silence. That's done it, Flint said. The circle is broken, the oath denied. Bad luck. He shook his head. Bad luck. Chapter 3. Night of Solandi. The Old Man's Party. Raceland leaned forward. He and Karen exchanged glances as thoughts passed wordlessly between them. It was a rare moment, for only great personal difficulty or danger ever made the twins' close kinship apparent. Kitiara was their older half-sister. Kitiara would not break her oath unless another, stronger oath bound her. Raceland spoke their thoughts aloud. What does she say? Caraman asked. Tanis hesitated, then licked his dry lips. Her duties with her new lord keep her busy. She sends her regrets and best wishes to all of us. And her love. Tanis felt his throat constrict. He coughed. Her love to her brothers and to... He paused, then rolled up the parchment. That's all. Love to who? Tasselhoff asked brightly. Ouch! He glared at Flint, who had trod upon his foot. The Kender saw Tanis flush. Oh, he said, feeling stupid. Do you know who she means? Tanis asked the brothers. What new lord does she talk about? Who knows with Kitiara? Raceland shrugged his thin shoulders. The last time we saw her was here in the inn 5 years ago. She was going north with Stern. We have not heard from her since. As for the new lord, I'd say we now know why she broke her oath to us. She has sworn allegiance to another. She is, after all, a mercenary. Yes, Tanis admitted. He slipped the scroll back into its case and looked at his teeth. You say this arrived under strange circumstances? Tell me. A man brought it in late this morning. At least I think it was a man. Tika shivered. He was wrapped head to foot in clothing of every description. I couldn't even see his face. His voice was hissing-like, and he spoke with a strange accent. Deliver this to one Tanis half-elven, he said. I told him you weren't here, and hadn't been here for several years. He will be, the man said. Then he left. Tika shrugged. That's all I can tell you. The old man over there saw him. She gestured to an old man, sitting on a chair before the fire. You might ask him if he noticed anything else. Tanis turned to look at an old man who was telling stories to a dreamy-eyed child, staring into the flames. Flint touched his arm. Here comes one who can tell you more, the dwarf said. Stern. Tanis said warmly, turning toward the door. Everyone except Raceland turned. The mage relaxed into the shadows once more. At the door stood a straight-backed figure dressed in full-plate armor and chainmail, the symbol of the Order of the Rose on the breastplate. A great many people in the inn turned to stare, scowling. The man was a Salamnic knight, and the knights of Solandia had fallen into ill repute up north. Rumors of their corruption had spread even this far south. The few who recognized Sturm as a long-time former resident of Solace shrugged and turned back to their drinking. Those who did not continued to stay. In these days of peace, it was unusual enough to see a knight in full armor enter the inn, but it was still more unusual to see a knight in full armor that dated back thousands. Sturm received the stairs and the accolades due his rank. He carefully smoothed his great, thick sandals, which, being the ages-old symbol of the knights, were as obsolete as his armor. He bore the trappings of the Solamnic knights with unquestioned pride, and he had the sword arm and the skill to defend that pride. Although people in the inn stared, no one, after one look at the knight's calm, cold eyes, dared snicker or make a derogatory comment. The knight held the door open for a tall man and a woman heavily cloaked in furs. The woman must have spoken a word of thanks to him, for he bowed to her in a courtly, old-fashioned manner, long dead in the modern world. Look at that. Caraman shook his head in admiration. The gallant knight helps the fair lady. I wonder where he dragged up those two. They're barbarians from the plains, said Tass, standing on a chair, waving his arms to his friend. That's the dress of the Quayshu tribe. Apparently, the two plainsmen declined any offer Sturm made, for the knight bowed again and left them. He walked across the crowded inn with a proud and noble air, such as he might have worn walking forward to be knighted by the king. Tanis rose to his feet. Sturm came to him first and threw his arms around his friend. Tanis gripped him tightly, feeling the knight's strong, sinewy arms clasp him in affection. Then the two stood back to look at each other for a brief moment. Sturm hasn't changed, Tanis thought, except that there are more lines around the sad eyes, more grey in the brown hair. The cloak is a little more frayed. There are a few more dents in the ancient armor, but the knight's fine moustaches, his pride and joy, were as long and sweeping as ever. His shield was polished just as brightly. His brown eyes were just as warm when he saw his friends. And you have a beard, Sturm said with amusement. Then the knight turned to greet Caraman and Flint. Tasselhoff dashed after more ale, Tika having been called away to serve others in the growing crowd. Greetings, knight, whispered Raceland from the corner. Sturm's face grew solemn as he turned to greet the other twin. Raceland, he said. The mage drew back his hood, letting the light fall on his face. Sturm was too well bred to let his astonishment show beyond a slight exclamation, but his eyes widened. Tanis realized the young mage was getting a cynical pleasure out of seeing his friend's discomfiture. Can I get you something, Raceland? Tanis asked. No, thank you, the mage answered, moving into the shadows once again. He eats practically nothing, Caraman said in a worried tone. I think he lives on air. Some plants live on air, Tasselhoff stated, returning with Sturm's ale. I've seen them. They hover up off the ground. Their roots suck food and water out of the atmosphere. Really? Caraman's eyes were wide. I don't know who's the greater idiot, said Flint in disgust. Well, we're all here. What news? All? Sturm looked at Tanis questioning. Kitiara? Not coming. Tanis replied steadily. We were hoping perhaps you could tell us something. Not I. The knight frowned. We traveled north together and parted soon after crossing the sea narrows into Old Solandia. She was going to look up relatives of her father, she said. That was the last I saw of her. Well, I suppose that's that, Tanis sighed. What of your relatives, Sturm? Did you find your father? Sturm began to talk, But Tanis only half listened to Sturm's tale of his travels in his ancestral land of Salami. Tanis's thoughts were on Kitjar. Of all his friends, she had been the one he most longed to see. After 5 years of trying to get her dark eyes and crooked smile out of his mind, he discovered that his longing for her grew daily. Wild, impetuous, hot-tempered, the sword's woman was everything Tanis was not. She was also human, and love between human and elf always ended in tragedy. Yet Tanis could no more get Kitiara out of his heart than he could get his human half out of his blood. Wrenching his mind free of memories, he began listening to Sturm. I heard rumors. Some say my father is dead. Some say he is alive. His face darkened. But no one knows where he is. Your inheritance? Karaman asked. Sturm smiled, a melancholy smile that softened the lines in his proud face. I wear it, he replied simply. My armor and my weapon. Tanis looked down to see that the knight wore a splendid, if old-fashioned, two-handed sword. Karaman stood up to peer over the table. That's a beauty, he said. They don't make them like that these days. My sword broke in a fight with an ogre. Theros Ironfeld put a new blade on it today, but it cost me dearly. So you're a knight now? Sturm's smile vanished. Ignoring the question, he caressed the hilt of his sword lovingly. According to the legend, this sword will break only if I do, he said. It was all that was left of my father's. Suddenly, Tass, who hadn't been listening, interrupted. Who are those people? The Kender asked in a shrill whisper. Tanis looked up as the two barbarians walked past their table, heading for empty chairs that sat in the shadows of a corner near the fire pit. The man was the tallest man Tanis had ever seen. Karaman, at 6 feet, would come only to this man's shoulder. But Karaman's chest was probably twice as big around, his arms 3 times as big. Although the man was bundled with the furs barbarian tribesmen live in, it was obvious that he was thin for his great height. His face, though dark-skinned, had the pale cast of one who has been ill or suffered greatly. His companion, the woman Sturm had bowed to, was so muffled in her fur-trimmed cape and hood that it was difficult to tell much about her. Neither she nor her tall escort glanced at Sturm as they passed. The woman carried a plain staff trimmed with feathers in barbaric fashion. The man carried a well-worn knapsack. They sat down in the chairs, huddled in their cloaks, and talked together in low voices. I found them wandering around on the road outside of town, Sturm said. The woman appeared near exhaustion, the man just as bad. I brought them here, told them they could get food and rest for the night. They are proud people and would have refused my help, I think, but they were lost and tired. Sturm lowered his voice. There are things on the road these days that it is better not to face in the dark. We met some of them, asking about a stop, Tanis said grimly. He described their encounter with Viewmaster Turda. Although Sturm smiled at the description of the battle, he shook his head. The Seeker guard questioned me about a staff outside, he said. Blue crystal, wasn't it? Karaman nodded and put his hand on his brother's thin arm. One of the slimy guards stopped us, the warrior said. They were going to impound Raced's staff, if you'll believe that, for further investigation, they said. I rattled my sword at them, and they thought better of the notion. Raceland moved his arm from his brother's touch, a scornful smile on his lips. What would have happened if they had taken your stuff? Tanis asked Raceland. The mage looked at him from the shadows of his hood, his golden eyes gleaming. They would have died, horribly, the mage whispered, and not by my brother's sword. The half-elf felt chilled. The mage's softly spoken words were more frightening than his brother's bravado. I wonder what is so important about a blue crystal staff that goblins would kill to get it, Tanis mused. There are rumors of worse to come, Sturm said quietly. His friends moved closer to hear him. Armies are gathering in the north, armies of strange creatures, not human. There is talk of war. But what? Who? Tanis asked. I've heard the same. And so have I, Karaman added. In fact, I heard... As the conversation continued, Tasselhoff yawned and turned away. Easily bored, the Kender looked around the inn for some new amusement. His eyes went to the old man, still spinning tales for the child by the fire. The old man had a larger audience now. The two barbarians were listening, Tass noted. Then his jaw dropped. The woman had thrown her hood back, and the firelight shone on her face and hair. The Kender stared in admiration. The woman's face was like the face of a marble statue, classic, pure, cold. But it was her hair that captured the Kender's attention. Tass had never before seen such hair, especially on the plainsmen, who were usually dark-haired and dark-skinned. No jeweler spinning molten strands of silver and gold could have created the effect of this woman's silver-gold hair shining in the firelight. One other person listened to the old man. This was a man dressed in the rich brown and golden robes of a seeker. He sat at a small round table, drinking mulled wine. Several mugs stood empty before him, and even as the Kender watched, he called sourly for another. That's Hedrick, Tico whispered as she passed the companion's table. The High Theocrat. The man called out again, glaring at Tika. She bustled quickly over to help him. He snarled at her, mentioning poor service. She seemed to start to answer sharply, then bit her lip and kept silent. The old man came to an end.
I'm not doing too bad, so how about yourself?
Are all your stories of the ancient gods true, old one?
He asked curiously. Tasselhoff saw
Just counting down the days to my birthday.
The Kender hoped he wouldn't bother the old man. Tass touched Tanis's arm to catch his attention, nodding his head toward the seeker with a look that meant there might be trouble. The friends turned. All were immediately overwhelmed by the beauty of the plainswoman. They stared in silence. The old man's voice carried clearly over the drone of the other conversation in the common room. Indeed, my stories are true, child. The old man looked directly at the woman and her tall. Ask these two. They carry such stories in their hearts.
Do you?
The boy turned to the woman eagerly.
Can you tell me a story?
The woman shrank back into the shadows, her face filled with alarm as she noticed Tanis and his friends staring at her. The man drew near her protectively, his hand reaching for his weapon. He glowered at the
safety meantime.
especially the heavily armed warrior, Karaman. Murderous bastard, Karaman commented, his hand strayed to his own sword. I can understand why, Sturm said, guarding such a treasure. He is her bodyguard, by the way. I gathered from their conversation that she's some kind of royal person in their tribe, though I imagine from the looks they exchanged that their relationship goes a bit deeper than that. The woman raised her hand in a gesture of protest. I'm sorry. The friends had to strain to hear her low voice. I am not a teller of tales.
Get another one done.
I have not the art. She spoke the common tongue. Her accent. The child's eager face filled with disappointment. The old man casually laughed, then looked directly into the woman's eyes. You may not be a teller of tales, he said pleasantly, but you are a singer of song, aren't you? Chieftains don't have. Sing the child your song, Gold Moon.
You know the one. From out of nowhere, apparently, a lute appeared in the old man's hands. He gave it to the woman, who stared at him in fear and
Oh,
astonishment.
hot on that one.
How do you know me, sir? She asked. The old man smiled gently. Sing for us, chieftain's daughter. The woman took the lute with hands that trembled visibly. Her companion seemed to make a whispered protest, but she did not hear him. Her eyes were held fast by the glittering black eyes of the old man. Slowly, as if in a trance, she began to strum the lute. As the melancholy chords drifted through the common
No doubt, that was a good one there.
conversations ceased. Soon, everyone was but she did not notice. Gold rings for the old man alone. The grasslands are endless, and summer sings on, and gold moon the princess loves a poor man's son. Her father the chieftain makes long roads between them. The grasslands are endless, and summer sees on. The grasslands are waving, the skies are blue. The chieftain sends river wind east and away to search for strong magic at the lip of the morning. The grasslands are waving, the sky's rim is grey. O river wind, where have you gone? O river wind, autumn comes on. I sit by the river and look to the sunrise, but the sun rises over the mountains alone. The grasslands are fading, the summer wind dies. He comes back, the darkness of stone. He carries a blue staff as bright as a glacier. The grasslands are fading, the summer wind dies. The grasslands are fragile, as yellow as flame. The chieftain makes mockery of river wind's claim. He orders the people to stone the young warrior. The grasslands are fragile, as yellow as flame. Grassland has faded, and autumn is here. The girl joins her lover. The stones whistle near. The star flares in blue light, and both of them vanish. The grasslands are fading, and autumn is here. There was heavy silence in the room as her hand struck the final chord. Taking a deep breath, she handed the lute back to the old man and withdrew into the shadows once more. Thank you, my dear, the old man said, smiling. Now can I have a story? The little boy asked wistfully. Of course, the old man answered and settled back in his chair. Once upon a time, the great god Paladin. Paladin, the child interrupted. I've never heard of a god named Paladin. A snorting sound came from the high theocrat, sitting at the nearby table. Tanis looked at Hedrick, whose face was flushed and scowling. The old man appeared not to notice. Paladin is one of the ancient gods, child. No one has worshipped him for a long time. Why did he leave? The little boy asked. He did not leave us, the old man answered, and his smile grew sad. Men left him after the dark days of the Cataclysm. They blamed the destruction of the world on the gods instead of on themselves, as they should have done. Have you ever heard the Canticle of the Dragon? Oh, yes, the boy said eagerly. I love stories about dragons, though Papa says dragons never existed. I believe in them, though. I hope to see one someday. The old man's face seemed to age and grow sorrowful. He stroked the young boy's hair. Be careful what you wish, my child, he said softly. Then he fell silent. The story? The boy prompted. Oh, yes. Well, once upon a time, Paladin heard the prayer of a very great knight, Huma. Huma from the Canticle? Yes, that's the one. Huma became lost in the forest. He wandered and wandered until he despaired because he thought he would never see his homeland again. He prayed to Paladin for help, and there suddenly appeared before him A white stag. Did Huma shoot it? The boy asked. He started to, but his heart failed him. He could not shoot an animal so magnificent. The stag bounded away. Then it stopped and looked back at him, as if waiting. Huma began to follow it. Day and night he followed the stag until it led him to his homeland. He offered thanks to the god Paladin. Blasphemy! Snarled a voice, loudly. A chair crashed back. Tanis put down his mug of ale, looking up. Everyone at the table stopped drinking to watch the drunken theocrat. Blasphemer! Hedrick, weaving unsteadily on his feet, pointed at the old man. Heretic! Corrupting our youth! I'll bring you before the council, old man. The seeker fell back a step, then staggered forward again. He looked around the room with a pompous air. Call the guards! He made a grandiose gesture. Have them arrest this man and this woman for singing lewd songs. Obviously a witch. I'll confiscate this staff. The seeker lurched across the floor to the barbarian woman, who was staring at him in disgust. He reached clumsily for her staff. No. The woman called Gold Moon spoke cool. That is mine. You cannot take it. Witch, the seeker sneered. I am High Theocrat. I take what I want. He started to make another grab for the staff. The woman's tall companion rose to his feet. The chieftain's daughter says you will not take it. The man said harshly. He shoved the seeker backward. The tall man's push was not rough, but it knocked the drunken theocrat completely off balance. His arms flailing wildly, he tried to catch himself. He lurched forward, too far, tripped over his official robes, and fell head first into the roaring fire. There was a whoosh and a flare of light, then a sickening smell of burning flesh. The theocrat's scream tore through the stunned silence as the crazed man leaped to his feet and started whirring around in a frenzy. He had become a living torch. Tanis and the others sat, unable to move, paralyzed with the shock of the incident. Only Tasselhoff had wits enough to run forward, anxious to try and help the man. But the theocrat was screaming and waving his arms, fanning the flames that were consuming his clothes and his body. There seemed no way that the little Kender could help him. Here. The old man grabbed the barbarian's feather-decorated staff and handed it to the Kender. Knock him down, then we can smother the fire. Tasselhoff took the staff. He swung it, using all his strength, and hit the theocrat squarely in the chest. The man fell to the ground. There was a gasp from the crowd. Tasselhoff himself stood, open-mouthed, the staff clutched in his hand, staring down at the amazing sight at his feet. The flames had died instantly. The man's robes were whole, undamaged. His skin was pink and healthy. He sat up, a look of fear and awe on his face. He stared down at his hands and his robes.
How's your night
There
going,
was not
son?
a mark on his skin. There was not the smallest cinder smoking on his robes. It healed him, the old man proclaimed loudly. The staff! Look at the staff! Tasselhoff's eyes went to the staff in his hands. It was made of blue crystal and was glowing with a bright blue light. The old man began shouting. Call the guards! Arrest the Kender! Arrest the barbarians! Arrest their friends! I saw them come in with this knight. He pointed at Sturm. What? Tanis leaped up. Are you crazy, old man? Call the guards! The word spread. Did you see? The blue crystal staff. We found it. Now they'll leave us alone. Call the guards! The theocrat staggered to his feet, his face pale, blotched with red. The barbarian woman and her companion stood up.
fear and alarm in their faces.
Foul witch!
Hedric's voice shook with rage.
You have cured me with evil. Even as I burn to purify my flesh, you will burn to purify your soul.
With that, the Seeker reached out, and before anyone could stop him, he plunged his hand back into the flames. He gagged with the pain, but did not cry out. Then, clutching his charred and blackened hand, he turned and staggered off through the murmuring crowd, a wild look of satisfaction on his pain-twisted face. You've got to get out of here. Tika came running over to Tanis, her breath coming in gasps. The whole town's been hunting for that staff. Those hooded men told the theocrat they'd destroy Solace if they caught someone harboring the staff. The townspeople will turn you over to the guards. But it's not our staff, Tanis protested. He glared at the old man and saw him settle back into his chair, a pleased smile on his face. The old man grinned at Tanis and winked. Do you think they'll believe you? Tika wrung her hands. Look! Tanis looked around. People were glaring at them balefully. Some took a firm grip on their mugs. Others eased their hands onto the hilts of their swords. Shouts from down below drew his eyes back to his friends. The guards are coming, exclaimed Tika. Tanis rose. We'll have to go out through the kitchen. Yes, she nodded. They won't look back there yet, but hurry. It won't take them long to surround the place. Years of being apart had not affected the companions' ability to react as a team to threat of danger. Caraman had pulled on his shining helm, drawn his sword, shouldered his pack, and was helping his brother to his feet. Raceland, his staff in his hand, was moving around the table. Flynn had hold of his battle axe and was frowning darkly at the onlookers who seemed hesitant about rushing to attack such well-armed men. Only Stern sat, calmly drinking his ale. Stub, Tanis said urgently. Come on, we've got to get out of here. Run? The knight appeared astonished. From this rabble? Yes. Tanis paused. The knight's code of honor forbade running from danger. He had to convince him. That man is a religious fanatic, Stone. He'll probably burn us at the stake, and a sudden thought rescued him. There is a lady to protect. The lady, of course. Stern stood up at once and walked over to the woman. Madam, your servant. He bowed. The courtly knight would not be hurried. It seems we are all in this together. Your staff has placed us in considerable danger, you most of all. We are familiar with the area around here. We grew up here. You, I know, are strangers. We would be honored to accompany you and your gallant friend and guard your lives. Come on, Tika urged, tugging on Tanis's arm. Caraman and Raceland were already at the kitchen door. Get the candle, Tanis told her. Tasselhoff stood, rooted to the floor, staring at the staff. It was rapidly fading back to its nondescript brown color. Tika grabbed Tass by his topknot and pulled him toward the kitchen. The kender shrieked, dropping the staff. Gold Moon swiftly picked it up, clutching it close to her. Although frightened, her eyes were clear and steady as she looked at Sturm and Tanis. She was apparently thinking rapidly. Her companion said a harsh word in their language. She shook her head. He frowned and made a slashing motion with his hand. She snapped a quick reply and he fell silent, his face dark. We will go with you, Gold Moon said to Sturm in the common tongue. Thank you for the offer. This way. Tanis herded them out through the swinging kitchen doors, following Tika and Tass. He glanced behind him and saw some of the crowd move forward, but in no great hurry. The cook stared at them as they ran through the kitchen. Caraman and Raceland were already at the exit, which was nothing more than a hole cut in the floor. A rope hung from a sturdy limb above the hole and dropped 40 feet to the ground. Ah! Exclaimed Tass, laughing. Here the ale comes up and the garbage goes down. He swung out onto the rope and shinnied down easily.
I'm sorry about this. Tika apologized to Gold Moon. But it is the only way out of here.
I can climb down the rope. Then the woman smiled and added, though I admit it has been many years. She handed her staff to her companion and grasped the stout rope. She began to descend, moving skillfully hand over hand. When she reached the bottom, her companion tossed the staff down, swung on the rope, and dropped through the hole. How are you going to get down, Race? Karaman asked, his face lined with concern. I can carry you on my back. Raceland's eyes flashed with an anger that startled Tannis.
I can get down myself,
the mage hissed. Before anyone could stop him, he stepped to the edge of the hole and leaped out into the air. Everyone gasped and peered down, expecting to see Raceland splattered all over the ground. Instead, they saw the young mage gently floating down, his robes fluttering around him. The crystal on his staff glowed brightly.
He shivers my skin,
Flint growled to Tannis. Hurry. Tannis shoved the dwarf forward. Flint grabbed hold of the rope. Karaman followed, the big man's weight causing the limb the rope was tied around to creak. I will go last, Sturm said, his sword drawn. Very well. Tannis knew it was useless to argue. He slung the longbow and quiver of arrows over his shoulder, grabbed the rope, and started down. Suddenly, his hands slipped. He slid down the rope, unable to stop it tearing the skin off his palms. He landed on the ground and looked, wincing, at his hands. His palms were raw and bleeding. But there was no time to think about them. Glancing up, he watched as Sturm descended. Tika's face appeared in the opening.
Go to my house,
she mouthed, pointing through the trees. Then she was gone.
I know the way,
Tasselhoff said, his eyes glowing with excitement.
Follow me.
They hurried off after the Kender, hearing the sounds of the guards climbing the stairway into the inn. Tannis, unused to walking on the ground in solace, was soon lost. Above him he could see the bridge walks, the street lamps gleaming among the tree leaves. He was completely disoriented, but Tass kept pushing forward confidently, weaving in and out among the huge trunks of the Valenwood trees. The sounds of the commotion at the inn faded. We'll hide at Tika's for the night, Tannis whispered to Sturm as they plunged through the underbrush. Just in case someone recognized us and decides to search our homes. Everyone will have forgotten about this by morning. We'll take the plainsmen to my house and let them rest a few days. Then we can send the barbarians on to Haven, where the Council of High Seekers can talk with them. I think I might even go along. I'm curious about this star. Sturm nodded. Then he looked at Tannis and smiled his rare, melancholy smile. Welcome home, the knight said. Same to you. The half-elf grinned. They both came to a sudden halt, bumping into Karaman in the dark. We're here, I think, Karaman said. In the light of the street lamps that hung in the tree leaves, they could see Tasselhoff climbing tree branches, like a gully dwarf. The rest followed more slowly, Karaman assisting his brother. Tannis, gritting his teeth from the pain in his hands, climbed up slowly through the rapidly thinning autumn foliage. Tass pulled himself up over the porch railing with the skill of a burglar. The Kender slipped over to the door and peered up and down the bridge walk. Seeing no one on it, he motioned to the others. Then he studied the lock and smiled to himself in satisfaction. The Kender slid something out of one of his pouches. Within seconds, the door of Tika's house swung open. Come in, he said, playing host. They crowded inside the little house.
the tall barbarian being forced to duck his head to avoid hitting the ceiling. Tass pulled the curtains shut. Sturm found a chair for the lady, and the tall barbarian went to stand behind her. Raistlin stirred up the fire. "Keep watch," Tanis said. Caraman nodded. The warrior had already posted himself at a window, staring out into the darkness. The light from a street lamp gleamed through the curtains into the room, casting dark shadows on the walls. For long moments, no one spoke, each staring at the others. Tanis sat down. His eyes turned to the woman. "The blue crystal staff," he said quietly. "It healed that man. How?" "I do not know," she faltered. "I haven't had it very long." Tanis looked down at his hands. They were bleeding from where the rope had peeled off his skin. He held them out to her. Slowly, her face pale, the woman touched him with the staff. It began to glow blue. Tanis felt a slight shock tingle through his body. Even as he watched, the blood on his palms vanished. The skin became smooth and unscarred. The pain eased, and soon left him completely. "True heal," he said in awe. Chapter 4. The Open Door. Flight into Darkness. Raistlin sat down on the hearth, rubbing his thin hands in the warmth of the small fire. His golden eyes seemed brighter than the flames as he stared intently at the blue crystal staff, resting across the woman's lap. "What do you think?" asked Tanis. "If she's a charlatan, she's a good one," Raistlin commented thoughtfully. "War, you dare to call the chieftain's daughter a charlatan?" The tall barbarian stepped toward Raistlin, his dark brows contracted in a vicious scowl. Caraman made a low, rumbling sound in his throat and moved from the window to stand behind his brother. "Rivogin." The woman laid her hand on the man's arm as he drew near her chair. "Please, he meant no harm. It is right that they do not trust us. They do not know us. And we do not know them," the man growled. "If I might examine it," Raistlin said. Goldmoon nodded and held out the staff. The mage stretched out his long, bony arm, his thin hands grasping for it eagerly. As Raistlin touched the staff, however, there was a bright flash of blue light and a crackling sound. The mage jerked his hand back, crying out in pain and shock. Caraman jumped forward, but his brother stopped him. "No, Caraman," Raistlin whispered hoarsely, wringing his injured hand. "The lady had nothing to do with that." The woman indeed was staring at the staff in amazement. "What is it then?" Tanis asked in exasperation. "A staff that heals and injures at the same time?" "It merely knows its own." Raistlin licked his lips, his eyes glittering. "Watch." "Caraman, take the staff." "Not me." The warrior drew back as if from a snake. "Take the staff," Raistlin demanded. Reluctantly, Caraman stretched out a trembling hand. His arm twitched as his fingers came closer and closer. Closing his eyes and gritting his teeth in anticipation of pain, he touched the staff. Nothing happened. Caraman opened his eyes wide, startled. He gripped the staff, lifted it in his huge hand, and grinned. "See there?" Raistlin gestured like an illusionist showing off a trick to the crowd. "Only those of simple goodness, pure in heart." His sarcasm was biting. "May touch the staff. It is truly a sacred staff of healing.
blessed by some god. It is not magic. No magic objects that I have ever heard of have healing powers. Hash, ordered Tasselhoff, who had taken Caraman's place by the window. The Theocrat's guards, he warned softly. No one spoke. Now they could all hear goblin footsteps flapping on the bridge walks that ran among the branches of the Valenwood trees. They're conducting a house-to-house search, Tanis whispered incredulously, listening to fists banging on a neighboring door.
The Seekers demand right of entry,
Croaked a voice. There was a pause, then the same voice said,
No one home. Can we kick the door in?
Ah, said another voice.
We'd better just report to the Theocrat. Let him kick the door down. Now, if it was unlocked, that'd be different. We're allowed to enter then.
Tanis looked at the door opposite him. He felt the hair rise on the back of his neck. He could have sworn they had shut and bolted the door. Now, it stood slightly open. The door, he whispered, Caraman. But the warrior had already moved over to stand behind the door, his back to the wall, his giant hands flexing. The footsteps flapped to a stop outside.
The Seekers demand right of entry.
The goblins began to bang, then stopped in surprise as it swung open.
This place is empty,
Said one.
let's move on.
You got no.
Alright, everyone. I'm going to call into this live for tonight. I'm actually a little tired. But I want to thank... Excuse me. I want to thank everyone for stopping by. Everyone who continues to stop by and chill with me and show me support. I definitely appreciate all y'all. Until next time, everyone. Y'all stay safe out there.